The storm came fast, howling, wild and merciless. It tore across the valley like it had been waiting for years to strike. Trees bowed and snapped like matchsticks. Rivers overflowed. Lightning split the sky again and again. And in the chaos, the herd scattered. Among them was Ash, the youngest, barely a year old, still with the softness of a colt in his eyes. He wasn't fast enough. By the time the sky cleared and the winds fell silent, the herd had regrouped near the ridgeline. But Ash was gone. His mother cried out, her hooves cutting into the muddy ground as she searched through the rain-drenched brush. Others helped at first, noses to the ground, calling in their own way. But when the second night fell, and there was still no trace, not even a scent, they stopped. Ash was assumed lost, dead most likely. But far from the herd, deep within the drenched forest, a trembling body stirred beneath a blanket of broken branches. Ash lay on his side, chest heaving, legs scraped raw. He had been thrown against a fallen log in the chaos, knocked cold. Now the forest around him dripped and steamed, silent in that eerie way that only follows disaster. Ash stood shakily, every muscle aching. His ears twitched, but there were no familiar sounds, no comforting snorts, no rustling of other hooves. Just the forest, wild, indifferent, and watching. He was alone, but something inside him, something that had nothing to do with instinct, whispered, "You need to go home." He didn't know how. He didn't know which direction was right, but he started walking anyway. The first days were confusion. Ash wandered between trees that all looked the same. The forest was thick with fog and shadows. Every sound made him flinch. A cracking branch, a bird taking flight, the distant howl of something that didn't sound friendly. He hadn't yet learned what danger smelled like, but his body understood fear. It pulsed through his legs, kept him moving even when his mind wanted to collapse. Food was another mystery. The sweet grasses of the open fields were gone. Here the earth was damp and sour. He nibbled bark, tried moss, chewed bitter leaves until he vomited. Hunger clawed at him, sharp and relentless. But giving up wasn't an option. Something deeper than hunger kept him moving, a faint memory of his mother's breath against his neck, of the sound she made when she nuzzled him to sleep. He walked toward that memory. On the fourth day, he found water, a shallow stream, icy and fast. He drank too quickly, coughing and choking, but he didn't care. It was the first time he felt alive since the storm. On the fifth night, he collapsed. His legs gave out. He lay there, ribs showing, too weak to lift his head. And that might have been the end, had it not been for the fox. It was small, curious, and just bold enough to approach. Ash didn't move. He didn't have the strength. The fox sniffed him, circled, then darted away into the brush. Ash closed his eyes, but the next morning he heard footsteps. Not hooves, boots. A boy, maybe 12 years old. Freckles, a red scarf, and eyes wide with disbelief. "Dad," the boy shouted, "there's a horse!" The man who came behind him was older, slower, a farmer, judging by the calluses in the tired posture. Ash didn't have the strength to run, even if he wanted to, but something about the man's approach was different, gentle, measured. The man knelt in the mud, his voice soft as he extended a hand. "You shouldn't be alive," he said quietly. Ash stared at him. The man didn't try to rope him, didn't shout or whistle. He just sat there, letting the silence settle. Eventually he stood. "You've got fight in you. If you want help, follow me. If not, I won't chase you." And he turned and walked away. For a long moment, Ash didn't move. Then he did. One step, then another. He followed. The farm wasn't far. A fenced pasture, an old red barn, and hay that smelled sweet and safe. The boy brought water. The man brought oats. Ash didn't understand their language, but he understood kindness. He stayed for 2 days, resting, eating, gaining back his strength. But the third morning, when the sun rose over the hills, he stood at the edge of the field and looked east, toward home. He couldn't stay. Something in his chest ached too deeply. The farmer seemed to understand. "You've got someone waiting," he said, scratching Ash's neck. "Go on then." No ropes, no fences, just open land. Ash ran, not fast, not gracefully, but with purpose. He crossed rivers, climbed slopes that tore his hooves, avoided predators by sheer luck and the ghost of instinct. He grew leaner, sharper, stronger. He learned to sleep lightly, always listening. He learned which berries to avoid, which branches made the best shelter from rain. He followed the stars when the sky was clear, the wind when it wasn't. Days turned into weeks, and then hoof prints, not his own, fresh, familiar. The curve of his mother's stride burned into his memory. He followed them, and on a ridge beneath a sky glowing with dusk, he saw them, his herd, grazing near the old oak. His mother stood at the edge, looking out, as if waiting for something the wind hadn't yet delivered. When she saw him, she didn't move right away, didn't believe. Then she ran, and Ash, older now, harder, but still her child, ran too. They collided like waves, nuzzling, crying, breathing each other in like air after drowning. She pressed her muzzle to his neck again and again, as if trying to memorize the scent she'd once feared she'd lost forever. He stood still, letting her check every part of him, his ribs, his legs, his eyes, as if she could somehow undo the distance with touch alone. Around them, the herd began to gather, cautious, curious, whispering with soft snorts and stamping hooves. They had assumed he was gone for good, taken by the storm, devoured by the forest. But here he was, not just alive, but changed. There was a weight in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a silence to his posture that didn't come from fear, but from knowing what it meant to walk alone, to starve without anyone noticing, to listen to the night and wonder if you were the last of your kind. Ash didn't speak. He didn't need to. His body carried the story, in every scar, in every hardened edge of muscle that hadn't been there before, in the way he moved, less colt, more survivor. His younger brother approached first, still lanky, still loud. He reared playfully and bumped Ash's shoulder, expecting their old game of chase. Ash didn't flinch, but he didn't play either. He simply looked at him, eyes soft, then nuzzled his brother's ear gently, as if to say, "Not now." Later that night, when the herd had settled and the stars burned overhead, Ash stood alone beneath the old oak. His mother joined him. "You remember this tree?" her eyes seemed to ask. He did. It was where she had taught him to listen for storms, to stay close, to trust the wind. And yet, it was the wind that had taken him away. She brushed against him, then rested her head along his shoulder. He didn't move, just closed his eyes. And for the first time since the storm, he slept deeply. And when he woke, something in the world had shifted. Not the place, it was the same hillside, the same ancient tree, the same familiar sounds of breath and hooves. But inside him, the chaos had quieted. The tension that had held his muscles like wire for weeks began to ease. For the first time, the silence didn't feel dangerous. It felt earned. He had survived something vast and unspeakable, and now he was still here. The herd moved that morning, as they always did, but Ash no longer followed from the back. He walked beside them, his pace matched to his mother's, his head held not high, but steady, measured. He didn't speak of what he had seen in the woods, but it was there in the way he watched the horizon. He had learned to see what others missed, the subtle shift in wind, the way the birds grew quiet before something changed, the smell of cold long before the air turned sharp. The other young ones began to notice. One evening, a small colt who barely remembered the storm approached him with timid eyes. "Were you really alone?" the colt seemed to ask. Ash didn't answer. Instead, he led the little one to the stream, showed him where the water was safest to drink, where the current pulled hardest, how the stones could be slippery in the dark. He was becoming something he had never planned to be, a guide, a quiet strength, a presence. And though he said nothing of it, each time the wind rustled the tall grass or the clouds darkened a little too quickly, his mother would glance at him, not with fear, but with a deep, unspoken trust. Ash had changed, but so had the way others saw him. He wasn't just the lost one anymore. He was the one who had come back, and that changed everything. There was a reverence in the way the others watched him now. Not fear, not distance, but something quieter, like the hush before rain. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. Nature didn't need stories spoken out loud to understand what had been endured. It felt it in the way he moved through space, with caution, but not hesitation, with awareness, but not panic. Ash had become part of something larger, not just the herd, but the land itself. He could read the sky differently now. He noticed when the grass shifted underfoot in ways others didn't. When the trees held their breath, he listened. And when one of the foals went missing, just for an hour, just long enough to worry, it was Ash who found him, calmly, without alarm, just led him back, as if the path had never been lost to him at all. That night, his mother lay beside him again. Her breathing was slower now. The worry that had once lived behind her eyes was dimming, not because she had forgotten what it meant to lose, but because she had seen what it looked like to return. They didn't speak, of course, but in the stillness between their bodies, there was a language, one that said, "You left as my child, but you came back carrying something more." And Ash knew it too. He no longer needed to prove he belonged. The wild had already done that for him. It had carved lessons into his bones, not with words, but with wind and hunger and silence. It had taken the softness of youth and shaped it into something else. Not hardness exactly, but resilience, a quiet kind of knowing. He didn't walk ahead of the herd. He didn't lead. But when others hesitated, they watched him. And when fear crept in through the trees, Ash didn't flinch, because he had already stood alone in the darkest parts of the forest, already listened to the silence where no one came, already decided and kept deciding to go on. That choice had changed him, and the herd felt it, even if they couldn't name it. The elders nodded when he passed. The young stayed close without asking why. And his mother, she had stopped watching the horizon, not because she'd given up, but because the thing she had once searched for was beside her again. Ash didn't seek attention. He didn't want it. But on the day the sky grew black again, when the winds began to shift and the scent of rain carried warning, he was the first to raise his head. He didn't panic. He didn't call out. He simply moved, and the others followed. They didn't question why. They didn't need to, because sometimes survival isn't about strength. It's about who moved first and who stayed beside you when it mattered most. That became the quiet truth Ash carried with him. Not the storm, not the forest, not even the pain, but the knowing that survival wasn't just about endurance. It was about presence, about staying when it was hard, when it was cold, when no one could promise it would get better. That lesson lived in his shadow now. One evening, the youngest foal in the herd, a fragile little filly with trembling legs, refused to cross a shallow river. The others had already moved on. The water wasn't deep, but to her it looked endless. She stood at the edge, legs locked, chest rising fast with panic. No one noticed, except Ash. He didn't call to her, didn't try to push her forward. He just walked back, stood beside her, quiet, still. He lowered his head to her level and waited. Minutes passed. Then she moved. Not because the river changed, not because her fear vanished, but because she wasn't alone anymore. Ash crossed with her, one slow step at a time. And on the other side, she looked at him with eyes wide and wet, not with fear, but something else. Gratitude and something deeper. Trust. That night she slept beside him, curled against his flank like a shadow finding its home. Ash didn't sleep right away. He watched the stars instead, and he realized that he was no longer returning from something. He had become something, a bearer of safety, a living memory of what it meant to be lost and still come back whole. Because the wild hadn't broken him, it had revealed him, not just to himself, but to everyone who had ever doubted their own strength, to every creature who had once hesitated at the edge of something dark and unfamiliar, to every mother who feared the storm would take more than it gave back, to every herd who had lost and learned to move on too soon. Ash had come back whole, not despite the wild, but because of it. And now, When the wind stirred the treetops or the thunder rolled in the distance, the herd no longer looked to the sky. They looked to him. He didn't give commands. He didn't raise his voice. But the way he turned his head, the way he stepped forward, was enough. And the foals followed first, then the elders, then everyone in between. Because sometimes what makes a leader isn't loudness. It's the silence that comes after pain. The kind that listens before it speaks. The kind that stands still until others are ready to walk again. Ash had become that stillness. And in doing so, he had become a kind of compass. Not the one who always knew the way, but the one who reminded them they could find it, even after being lost, even after being afraid, even after thinking it was too late, because that's when it matters most, when all signs say it's over, and you choose to move anyway. Ash had felt it himself, on the coldest nights alone, when even the stars refused to shine. He had walked forward when there was no path, only memory, and now that memory lived on, not just in him, but around him. In the way the herd no longer feared pauses, in the way the young no longer panicked at thunder, in the way his mother, once restless and watchful, now grazed in peace. There was a shift in the rhythm of things, and though no one said it aloud, they all began to understand. Ash's journey hadn't just brought him back, it had brought them back to a sense of wonder, back to the belief that absence doesn't mean loss, that love once given fully doesn't vanish in the dark. It waits, it echoes, it walks beside you, even when unseen. Ash would still pause sometimes at the edge of a new clearing, nose lifted, ears tuned. Not in fear, but in recognition, as if the wind carried something familiar, as if part of him still remembered that lonely field, the boy with freckles, the kind man who didn't try to hold him, just offered space to rest. That was what saved him. Not rescue, not force, but space. Gentle, sacred space, where his fear was allowed to breathe, where no one demanded he be brave right away, where healing wasn't rushed, but witnessed. He hadn't known in that moment on the farm what it meant to be held without being touched. But now he did, and without realizing it, he began offering that same space to others, not with words, but with presence. When a young stallion lashed out in frustration, Ash didn't retaliate. He just stood still, eyes calm, letting the storm pass. When an older mare fell behind the herd, Ash slowed his pace, walking beside her until she no longer needed the comfort. And when foals had nightmares, waking in the dark with wide, frightened eyes, they always found their way to where Ash slept, pressing their small bodies close, breathing with him until they calmed. No one told them to. No one taught them, but they knew, because the wild had taught Ash, and now he was teaching them without even trying. Because some things don't need effort to be real, they just are, like the warmth of the sun or the way the earth holds your weight without question. Ash had become one of those things. Not a hero, not a legend, but something quieter, something steadier, a kind of living proof that you could be broken and still belong, that you could disappear and still be found, that you could carry silence inside you and still speak without words. Seasons began to shift. The grasses turned golden, the nights grew longer, and Ash remained, not unchanged, no, but unshakable. And slowly the herd stopped watching him with awe and started moving with him in rhythm, not behind, not beneath, beside, as if something sacred had been restored, as if the herd itself had remembered something old, something about love, about waiting, about how to walk with someone even after they've wandered far. Ash didn't ask for this. He had only wanted to survive, but the wild had made him into something more. And now every path they walked, every stream they crossed, every hill they climbed, carried traces of him, not told but lived. Because stories like Ash's don't echo through generations as words. They pass through hooves pressed into soft ground, through eyes that watch the wind a little longer, through pauses that mean I'll wait with you instead of hurry up. And so the herd changed, not all at once, but day by day. The young ones learned to notice more, to move with care, to offer stillness when someone stumbled instead of rushing ahead. And the old ones, who had once believed that strength meant speed, began to understand the power of staying. Ash never gave a lesson, but the way he stood beside the quiet, the way he never left the lost, the way he watched the world like it mattered, that became their compass. Even the land seemed to remember. Paths softened where he walked. Trees leaned gently above the resting places he'd once used. And on cold mornings, when fog cloaked the fields, the herd would follow the warmth of the places he chose. Without question, because something had shifted, not just in Ash, but in all of them. They were no longer just survivors. They were something more, something shaped by return, by presence, by love that didn't leave when it was hard, because that was the kind of love that didn't shout. It waited, it endured, it remembered. It was the kind of love that circled back when others moved on, that left space instead of demands, that didn't measure worth by how fast you returned, but that you returned at all. And slowly, that kind of love became the way the herd moved. They no longer rushed the weak, no longer shamed the slow. They built themselves around those who needed more time. Because Ash had shown them, without speeches, without rules, that survival wasn't just about strength. It was about tenderness, offered when the world gave none. About stillness, offered when the wind screamed loud. About presence, held like shelter when the storm refused to pass. They hadn't needed words to learn it. They had watched him, day after day. And in that quiet watching, something sacred had been passed on. A new rhythm, a new way of being. Rooted not in fear, but in return. Because return meant more than just finding your way back. It meant choosing to come back different, and being allowed to. Ash had not returned to reclaim his old place. He had outgrown it. Instead, he had created something new. A space where others too could find their way back. Not to what was, but to what could be. He had walked through silence and made it safe. He had walked through hunger and made it teach. He had walked through solitude and made it sacred. And in doing so, he had planted something invisible but unshakable in the soil of those who moved beside him. A new kind of strength, one that didn't come from winning, but from witnessing, from staying, from remembering what love feels like when it returns with nothing in its hands except presence. It changed them. Not in a single moment, but across hundreds of quiet ones, where a foal no longer feared the dark, where a mother no longer searched the horizon, where the wind no longer meant danger, just memory. Because when love stays through the storm, even the storm becomes part of the story you no longer run from. The forest that once held Ash in its lonely silence now stood like a witness, not of fear, but of transformation. The trail he had carved with shaking legs had become a path others could follow. Not because it was easy, but because it had been walked with heart. Foals began to wander a little further now, not recklessly, but bravely, because they knew that somewhere out there, a horse had once gotten lost and come back. And if he could come back, maybe they could too. Not just to the herd, but to themselves. So when the wind blew across the valley, curling through grass and bone, they no longer flinched. They listened, because it didn't sound like a threat anymore. It sounded like a reminder. That love, real love, might lose its way, but it always remembers. And sometimes it comes home on four bruised legs, with a quiet gaze and a story etched into its silence. A story that didn't need to be told aloud, because it lived in everything he touched. In the grass that leaned differently where he had once fallen. In the stream that curved just slightly toward the spot he had once drunk from, trembling and alone. In the young ones who now stood taller, simply because they had seen him stand. Even the land seemed to bend gently around the places he had passed through. Not in awe, but in respect. Because stories like Ash's aren't loud. They don't arrive with fanfare. They don't seek attention. They breathe quietly through generations, through gestures, through the instinct to stay when it would be easier to walk away, through the choice to wait even when the heart is breaking. And so the herd changed. Not because Ash asked them to, but because they saw who he became after being broken, and who he remained after coming back. Because sometimes coming back isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new one. Ash didn't speak of the wild, didn't try to explain where he'd been, but it lived in his steps, in the way he greeted the morning light with stillness, in the way he paused before every crossing, not in fear, but in gratitude. And slowly others began to do the same. The herd no longer moved just to survive. They moved with memory, with rhythm, with reverence. The youngest foals were taught not just how to run, but how to return. They learned that strength was not in outrunning the storm, but in waiting out the silence. That sometimes the bravest thing you could do was come back softer. Ash never asked to be followed, but one by one they did. Not because he led with power, but because he had once been lost and had the courage to let the journey change him. That was the legacy he carried. Not just survival, but transformation. The kind the world feels long after the hoof prints have faded, because what matters most doesn't live in what's seen, it lives in what's felt. Ash's story didn't end where his trail disappeared. It began to echo in the pauses between movement, in the way the herd slowed down at dusk, in the way mothers watched their young a little longer before turning away, in the way even the wind seemed to soften when it passed through the valley he had once crossed. His legacy wasn't carved into stone. It was carried in breath, in instinct, in memory passed from eye to eye, from silence to silence. Sometimes a young colt would stand on the ridge at dawn, nose high, ears twitching, not knowing why he felt calm, only knowing he did. Sometimes the elders would gather under the old oak, not to speak, but to remember something they couldn't quite name. And sometimes when storms gathered on the horizon, the herd wouldn't panic. They would wait. Because someone had once walked into the storm and come back. Because someone had once made the wild feel a little less wild, and the world a little more like home. Not because the trees had changed, not because the wind had calmed, but because they had. Because Ash had. He had shown them that home wasn't just where you were safe, it was where you were seen. Where your scars weren't hidden, but held. Where you didn't have to be who you were before the storm, only who you became after it. That kind of home didn't need fences. It needed memory. It needed patience. It needed someone who had been lost and still chose to return. And because Ash had returned, others began to believe they could too. Even the land seemed to remember him, not in the way it remembered thunder or flood, but in the quiet green that came after, the way the grass leaned toward his steps, the way the birds didn't scatter when he passed, the way the earth in some places felt warmer beneath tired hooves. Not because it was easier, but because it had been walked by someone who knew the way back, and not just back to a place, but back to trust, to hope, to something softer than fear and stronger than instinct. Ash had walked that way not once, but every day since he returned. Each step he took reinforced the invisible trail he'd carved. Each pause became a landmark for those too tired to go on. Each moment of stillness whispered to the world, "You are not alone here. You are not forgotten." So when others faltered, when hooves trembled, when the forest darkened again, when doubt crept in like fog, they didn't look for the fastest or the strongest. They looked for him. And if Ash was moving, they moved too. Not because he demanded it, but because he reminded them that there was a way back. Always. Even if the path disappeared. Even if the trail was cold. Even if you couldn't remember how to begin. Ash had shown them. Sometimes it's not the path that brings you home. It's the choice to believe that one still exists. They never built a monument for Ash. There was no statue, no name carved into stone, no song sung in the open fields. But if you followed the wind just right, if you listened in the hush between rustling leaves, if you stood still near the old oak at dusk, you might feel something shift, a memory, a presence, a path that still remembers the weight of one who walked it with love, not just for himself, but for all who would come after. Because Ash didn't return to be remembered. He returned so others would never be forgotten. And in doing so, he made the wild feel a little less wild, and the world a little more like home. If this story touched you, share it, so more hearts remember what it means to find your way home.